Good evening and welcome. My name is Sid Schneid. I'm the co-chair of Independent Jewish Voices, and I'm really delighted to see the turnout tonight. We initially could only nail down a hall for 70 from SFU. The pre-enrollments took that to the next level of 105, and then SFU contacted me and said they wanted to get in here because that 105 had been exceeded. And believe me, this was with a minimum of advertising. So I think that it's just tribute to the amount of interest that people have in the subject that we've gotten a turnout like this. Founded at a national gathering in Toronto in April 2008, IJV brings together Jews from across Canada from diverse backgrounds, occupations, and affiliations who share a commitment to social justice and universal human rights. We believe that the broad spectrum of opinion among the Jewish population of this country is not reflected by organizations which purport to represent the Jewish community as a whole. And just for instance, if you would like to come up and see this later, there are a couple of full-page color ads put in the National Post by B'nai B'rith, one of which was about ostensibly anti-Semitic attacks on students returning to university, and another was an Islamophobic ad drawing a parallel between the Mufti of Jerusalem and Adolf Hitler. And it's exactly to counter these kinds of arguments and influences and spectacles and to put forth a counter vision of society and organize for social justice that we came into existence. We believe that individuals and groups should feel free to express their views on any issue of public concern without incurring accusations of disloyalty or of being anti-Semitic. We are resolved to promote alternative perspectives, particularly in respect to the grave situation in the Middle East, which threatens the futures of both Israelis and Palestinians, as well as the stability of the whole region and the wider world. Independent Jewish Voices is guided by the following basis of unity. 1, human rights are universal and indivisible and should be upheld without exception. This is applicable in Israel and the occupied Palestinian territories as it is elsewhere. 2, Palestinians and Israelis alike have the right to peaceful and secure lives. 3, peace and stability require the willingness of all parties to the conflict to comply with international law. 4, there is no justification for any form of racism, including anti-Semitism, anti-Arab racism, or Islamophobia in any circumstance. 5, the battle against anti-Semitism is vital and is undermined whenever opposition to Israeli government policy is automatically branded as anti-Semitic. We believe that these principles are contradicted when those who claim to speak on behalf of Jews in Canada and other countries consistently put support for the policies of an occupying power above the human rights of an occupied people. The Palestinian inhabitants of the West Bank and Gaza face appalling living conditions with desperately little hope for the future. We declare our support for a negotiated peace between the Israeli and Palestinian people and oppose any attempt by the Israeli government to impose its own solutions on the Palestinians. Finally, we are determined to reclaim the tradition of Jewish support for universal freedoms, human rights, and social justice. The lessons we have learned from our own history compel us to speak out. We commit ourselves to make our views public on a continuing basis. Consistent with these founding principles, we participated in the United Nations Conference Against Racism in Geneva in April, the United Church 2009 National Conference in Kelowna last August, and we have made common cause with other groups and individuals to defend freedom of speech against efforts like the badly misnamed Canadian Parliamentary Coalition to Combat Anti-Semitism, or CPCCA. If you're not familiar with what the CPCCA is, Google that, CPCCA. In addition, we have mounted educational sessions and forums like the one we have here tonight, featuring the prominent Jewish theologian Marc Ellis. Tonight's forum is co-sponsored by Canadian Friends of Sabeel, the Canada-Palestine Support Network, the SFU Institute for the Humanities Working Group on Citizenship and Religion, Jews for a Just Peace, and the Near East Cultural and Education Foundation. Now for tonight's speaker. Marc H. Ellis is a leading authority on contemporary Judaism and is widely recognized as one of the most influential Jewish thinkers of his generation. A university professor of American and Jewish Studies and the founding director of the Center for Jewish Studies at Baylor University, he is the author of 15 books and has written articles for the International Herald Tribune, Christian Century, and Haaretz. Ellis regularly provides commentary and analysis on National Public Radio in the States and the BBC, and has been inducted into the Martin Luther King Jr. Collegium of Scholars at Morehouse College. He lives in Waco, Texas. Professor Ellis has drawn the attention of some very well-known activists and commentators. Bishop Desmond Tutu has said that Marc Ellis shows the voice of prophecy has not been silenced in the Jewish community. Prominent Palestinian activist Professor Edward Said described Ellis as a man to be listened to with respect and admiration. Renowned political commentator Noam Chomsky calls Ellis a man of great courage, integrity, and insight. After Professor Ellis has spoken, we'll hear from a panel of respondents and then open the floor to questions from members of the audience. I ask you to join me in providing Professor Ellis a warm welcome to Vancouver.
Thank you very much for that introduction, and I'm glad to be in Vancouver. I've been here several times, but never get to see the city. But I know it's beautiful. I'm coming to the end. In fact, this is my final presentation of a cross-Canada tour, which started a long time ago. I started out in Hamilton, then went to Halifax, Toronto, Ottawa, Montreal, Winnipeg, and now Vancouver. And this trip, as most tours, has been filled with many, many events, many discussions, some angry, some friendly, some tearful. A full time discussing Jewish identity, Jewish particularity, Jewish commitment, and especially the Jewish prophetic. The Jewish prophetic is the center of my life and of many Jews around the world. And I have met so many young and not so young Jews whose life is focused on the prophetic, whether they announce that or not. But for me, it's important to discuss the prophetic, where it's been and where it's going, because it is within the prophetic that the future of the Jewish people lies. Without the prophetic, there is no reason to be Jewish. And I believe that the people Israel gave the prophetic to the world. From my perspective, it's the greatest gift to the world. Without the prophetic, there is no meaning in the world. There may be no meaning in the world. The prophet embodies the possibility of meaning in the world. But it is also true that the people Israel are the great strugglers against the prophetic. Both. Now in every community we have the prophetic, and we have those who struggle against the prophetic. But in the Jewish community, it's highlighted. And it's important for me to locate where that prophetic is today and to see where it's going. Today, the Constantinian Jewish establishment is trying to destroy the prophetic. When I say Constantinian, those of you who are familiar with Christianity and its history should know that Christianity started as a small Jewish sect around a courageous and outrageous Jew. And until the 4th century was pretty much of a nothing in the world, until Constantine got this vision in war that Jesus Christ had helped him win, and then established Christianity as the religion of the empire. And it's gone downhill ever since. So we had Constantinian Christianity, and the idea is that religion gets a special place in the empire and blesses empire. Well, today we have a Constantinian Judaism, not because Jews are the majority, no, but because we've linked with empire. We bless empire in America, in Israel, and I've learned this trip in Canada too. May I take a moment? I travel all over the world, and it's so great that Barack Obama is now President of the United States. I don't have to answer the questions about George Bush. In coming to Canada, Canadians have been so polite but have told me in so many ways that Canada is not America, that you're far advanced of us, and it's just a delight to see that you have a prime minister who's outdoing George Bush. So I just, because I've been coming up here for so many years, please let me bask in this. And to hear about the attempt to criminalize speech about Israel, wow, we haven't even thought of that in the United States. So by the next time I come, you may have a different prime minister, so I wanted to just... We can have call and response if it's friendly. So some years ago, I've got to tell you this. Actually, this was my idea, but my student, who actually does the PowerPoint, is from Poland, a young Pole who has come to be my assistant and is my assistant in the Holocaust class last spring and now coming this spring. And she's learning for the first time details about the 3 million Jews that were killed in Poland during the Holocaust. But she's also learning that Jews are not innocent. It's interesting to see her balance this. And here we have the Western Wall, Orthodox Jews praying, and out of that wall comes the tower that is part of the wall that is surrounding Palestinians. And of course we have the Torah scroll and helicopter gunships coming out of it. Now, by the way, if there are Jews who affirm this as the way of our survival, no problem, because nation states do that. Just admit it. Don't say we're innocent in our empowerment. We were innocent in our suffering, but like any people, we are not innocent in our empowerment. So if you want this, say it. Say it out loud. Celebrate it, but don't try to hide it. But Jews can't do that. This comes back to the prophetic. Jews have always defined themselves as exceptional. I didn't say we've always been. I didn't say we've always been. But Jews have always defined themselves as exceptional. Perhaps we have been, but I'm not saying that. So no Jew in authority is going to admit this. What we want is power and remaining exceptional. This is a book I first wrote. First edition was in 1987, Toward a Jewish Theology of Liberation. I wrote my first article on a Jewish theology of liberation in 1984, after I had been to Israel, Palestine for the second time and had met Palestinians. The first time I was there was in 1973, and I went there on a dare, because after the '67 war, my Hebrew school teacher had gone, as many were taken, to Israel free of charge, and came back talking to me about the beauty of Israel, and I had no reason to doubt him. But I had read an article in Time or Newsweek titled something like The Second Palestinian Exile or Exodus. about the Palestinians that had been driven out during and after the 1967 war, and just quite innocently, I asked him if he had met any of these people. I think they're called Palestinians. Well, he got very angry at me. He had already wanted me to have my hair cut because he thought I would be a Jewish leader in the future, so he wanted my hair short, and it was quite long. My mother liked it. But he came out, and he said, "You don't know anything. You've never been there." And I hadn't. And we didn't think of jet travel quite in the same way we do today. But I thought to myself, I'm going to go there someday, somehow. And in 1973, I was studying in London. And when my friends went to Morocco, by the way, they met up with Mick Jagger and got high with him. So that was the story. I went to Israel by myself. And it was 1973 and October. And I was caught in the middle of the war, the October War. I saw there something, without knowing the history and without any bias against Israel, that people who looked like me, that is European Jews, were on top, and people who looked like they were indigenous to the land were on bottom, Arabs. And of course, we had just gone through the civil rights struggle, and obviously this was in my mind as well. But I didn't know what to say and how to say it, and I was young. But in 1984, when I was invited to Israel, I told them that I would go, but they'd have to keep me for 2 weeks, and I wanted to meet Palestinians. I was invited by a Protestant Catholic dialogue group at Tantur, right outside of Jerusalem. And there I traveled among Palestinians, and I was one of the first Jews who wasn't a military person to travel among Palestinians. And I went throughout the West Bank, sometimes introduced as a Jew, sometimes I couldn't be, and into Gaza. And I sat there in Gaza in homes where parents had lost their children to Israeli military. And they called them martyrs. And of course, I had learned about Jewish martyrs all through history, and including the Holocaust. And there I was sitting in Gaza with martyrs that had been created by my people. And what was I supposed to say to these mothers and fathers? So when I came back, I was determined to speak. But how do you speak after the Holocaust? I didn't know much about Israeli history. Who did? We weren't taught that history. The same thing with my students in the Holocaust at Baylor. The most difficult thing about the Holocaust for them is learning about Christian anti-Semitism. And why should a Jew be the first one to tell them about that? They're not taught about the dark side of their history. And I always wondered how Christians could teach their children Christianity. Did they just say everything was beautiful, or did they also teach them about the other side? But then I was being confronted, and when my first child was born in 1987, there it was, my book came out. I was writing as he was being born. What was I going to say to my children about being a Jew? I want to report that it's fine. I've told them the truth, and they love being Jewish. And after the assault on me and other Jews of conscience, it is a miracle. Now, I never believed in miracles, so I must confess I'm a non-miracle Jew. Although I do believe that the burning bush was not consumed. But I've never seen a burning bush that wasn't. So it's a miracle when I see young Jews, as I have on this trip, embodying the prophetic. At the end of Jewish history, as we have known it and inherited it. That's where we are, at the end. I had to ask the question, what does it mean? Liberation. In our time, I was hanging out with Christian liberation theologians, traveling all over the world to Latin America, Africa, and Asia. They were asking, what does it mean for the poor to be liberated? They never had to think about what would it mean when they were. It was way too far away. But we had been liberated. We now had power. Was that liberation? Or in the oppression of another people, was that another form of enslavement? Judaism does not equal Israel. My latest book, I didn't choose the title. It's part of a does not equal series, as in Catholic does not equal Vatican. Islam does not equal fundamentalism. Evangelical Christian does not equal Republican. And by the way, it doesn't. I live among evangelical Christians, and it's amazing the variety. There are some Republicans, but there are some Democrats and beyond. It's a very full life when you live in the area that you think about and sometimes condemn. So I got the best title. But I'll tell you, in your bookstores in Canada, I've been in a lot of airports, I haven't seen it once. I keep looking for it. And I'm going to get someone to take a photograph of me if I find it, for sure. But the question, the reason why it's not in the bookstores, published by a major press, is because that title is considered blasphemous. Now, there's no rabbi in the world, no matter how much they support Israel, that would say Judaism equals Israel. They might say Jews have to support Israel. Yes, there are many rabbis who say that. But there isn't one rabbi in the world, now I know somebody will correct me, who would say Judaism equals Israel. It's really not a radical title, but it's considered blasphemy. Now, in the local Jewish newspaper here, there's a title of an editorial today. Judaism does equal Israel. Amazing. But there isn't a rabbi in the world that would say that. So why is it blasphemous? Because they know I'm raising the question of what does it mean to be Jewish in the context of Israel oppressing another people. Now, you might think it's plain justice because most Jews on any other issue would say, you're right, South Africa does not equal white. America does not equal white, right? But on this, it's a line we can't cross. For those who do, this is another one of my books. Don't worry, they're not read. I just put them up there to apprise you of the fact that they were written. It's no problem. I'm used to it. Practicing exile. Most Jews of conscience, I've already talked about Constantinian Jews, right? Jewish establishment. Then we have progressive Jews who think they're in a civil war with the Constantinian establishment, but actually are much more like them than they would like to think. Constantinian Jews argue that Jews are innocent in our suffering and innocent in our empowerment. So everything Israel does is innocent. Progressive Jews say Jews are innocent in our suffering and innocent in Israel, but after the 1967 war, we did some things wrong. We need to correct them so we can return to our innocence. So, for instance, progressive Jews say yes to a Palestinian state and dismantling of the settlements, because that's wrong, but it never really gets down to the basics of which ones, because the settlements around Jerusalem really aren't settlements, they're cities. They're not going anywhere. And progressive Jews are interesting, too, because they say Palestinians need to be separate from us. We'll give them a state. It's not really defined what that would be. But it's got to be demilitarized because we have to have our security guaranteed. And of course, that means since they're demilitarized in a world that isn't, they need to be protected. And they'll be protected by the Israeli Defense Forces, according to progressive Jews. And Tikkun, Michael Lerner, I don't know if you've heard of that magazine in the United States, and the editor. And the reason they can be protected by the Israeli Defense Forces, even though they expelled them from Palestine, what became Israel, we'll look at some maps in a moment, and even though they have pushed them further into the West Bank and occupy parts of the West Bank on a permanent basis, the reason why Palestinians can't have an army is they can't be trusted, because maybe Arabs can't be trusted. The reason why the Israeli Defense Forces can protect them is because we can be trusted and because Jews are good. It's sort of the same reason that Israel can have nuclear weapons and Iran can't. Now, I'm not in favor, let me make it clear, not in favor of Iran having nuclear weapons. I'd like there to be no nuclear weapons, but I do find it interesting. The United States can have it. The UK can have it. I asked about Canada. They say, no, you don't have it, but you have ours. So we're just going to say you have them whether you like it or not. So those Jews of conscience, differentiating from progressive Jews and Constantinian Jews, say that Constantinian Jews and progressive Jews are so close together that progressive Jews are really the left wing of Constantinian Judaism, and we need to leave in order to get a perspective that's different, because both Constantinian Jews and progressive Jews hit at Jews of conscience because they're coming closer to the center of the question. Jews of conscience believe that Jews are not innocent in our empowerment, and they go back to 1947 and 1948 with the ethnic cleansing of Palestinians, 700, 800,000, as an original sin. When you get there, and some of the other ideas of Jews of conscience, you're in exile. So a significant part of the Jewish community, including some Jewish Israelis, are in exile. What does that exile mean for the future of Jews and Judaism? And how can we practice our Jewishness in exile? Because we're with many other exiles, Christian exiles, Catholic exiles, Muslim exiles, American exiles, exiles from the Philippines, exiles all over the world. We're really a community of exiles, aren't we? What I call the new diaspora, where we have fragmented and almost destroyed particularities that come into exile with other fragmented and almost destroyed particularities. And no one particularity will become a universal, but we're in dialogue with one another. You know, exiles always think they're going home, right? So for 30 years, one exile says to the other, I'm going home, and the other one says, I'm going home too. But you don't go home. So that's our community. My question in practicing exile is, will there be a surviving Jewish particularity in that exile? Now, for some of you, it may not be important. It's okay. It is to me. And I think it is to the broader community, because every one of those particularities is important. Well, if Judaism does equal Israel, as the editorial stated, here are some pictures to think about. This is the fence, the barrier, and the wall, all in the West Bank. I want to just go through some visuals so we know where we are. Now, the fence here is not like the fence that I used to climb over to play baseball. I had a little fence in an elementary school, loved climbing it, because there was baseball on the other side, but this is not that kind of fence. This is a fence that cuts through Palestinian territory, separating Palestinians, towns and fields, and you can see that the land it takes up, these can run for miles. On both sides of the fence, you see the ditches. And of course, there's sensory equipment all through to tell Israeli soldiers if there are Palestinians there, right? So when somebody said to me in the beginning, oh, it's just a fence, that's it. When I had a discussion with the ambassador to Boston, I had a lecture with him. He told me not to worry about the wall, it was temporary. If you've seen the wall, it doesn't look temporary. These are olive trees being uprooted. There are hundreds or maybe thousands of olive trees that have been uprooted. It's, of course, land, economy, but also symbols for Palestinians of steadfastness in the land. Remember, in the Holocaust, we can't even wrap our mind around 6 million Jews. It's so many, right? It's unbelievably horrible. But we were also humiliated as a people. And when the Nazis rounded up Jews, they often did it on the Sabbath, on Passover, on Rosh Hashanah, on Yom Kippur. They often gathered Jews in synagogues where they had to stay for days. They had to defecate in the synagogue. They used to parade the rabbis, their beards shaven in front of the community. We were humiliated as a people. We weren't just robbed. We weren't just imprisoned. We weren't just killed. We were humiliated as a people. Well, the tower that runs along the wall, I was a little retro. I thought that soldiers would be in these towers. They can be, but they don't have to be. Again, it's equipment that monitors Palestinians, and of course it looks over into where they're living. Of course, we Jews remember ghettos, right? This is another fence that guards the settlers' only road from rocks being thrown and Palestinians using that road. Kakilia, the whole city is surrounded by the wall. Again, if Judaism equals Israel, then show these pictures at the synagogue services as something we should be proud of. Signs. Bethlehem. Peace be with you. Once I attended an Easter Mass. I was working at the Catholic Worker, and it was an Easter Mass. A friend took me to her home in Connecticut for some rest. And the priest talked about the whole time about the blood on the hands of the Jews. And as I walked out, he didn't know I was Jewish. He said, "Peace be with you." Well, I was younger then. He put out his hand to shake it, and I said, "It's bloody. You don't want it." But peace be with you. We remember also signs and places that we were taken that didn't quite say what was going to happen, right? And what happens to the language of Hebrew? And I wrote another, actually it was read a little bit, titled Unholy Alliance, Religion and Atrocity in Our Time. And I quoted from George Steiner, who's a European Jew, who talked about how the German language was polluted forever by the use of the terms that the Nazis used. That, in fact, the language was now infected with atrocity. Well, there we have peace be with you in Hebrew. What happens to Hebrew, the sacred language, when it's used to torture people? Is Hebrew also infected with atrocity? So the wall, fence, barrier, call it what you want. Security wall, it's in the West Bank. If Israel wants to build a wall on its territory, I don't think it's a good idea, but I wouldn't say anything. President Carter calls it an apartheid wall. From the perspective of Jewish history, we might as well call it a ghetto wall. Now, people ask me, what's going to happen over time within that wall or those walls? I said, I don't know. I don't make predictions. But if you want to read about what happens, read the history of ghettos. And you'll get the possibilities of what might happen over time. Well, here are some maps. Those are some visualizations, if in fact Judaism does equal Israel. Here are some maps also that need to be looked at. Now, my idea about mapping is very simple. In our personal, communal, religious, national lives, we have maps inside. And we tend to show the good maps. The sign of maturity is to get those maps that we don't want to see and put them out there. That's sort of one way of defining maturity. It's not pretty, but it's honest. Well, this is the map to start out of what is supposed to be the two-state solution, not perfect justice for Palestinians, but we have Israel in green, and in lighter green, the West Bank, part of Jerusalem, and on the left, the Gaza Strip, supposedly connected, supposed to be connected by a road or a bridge or a tunnel. And that is the two-state solution. By the way, I'm a two-stater, although we're not going to have two states. We have one state now that goes from Tel Aviv to the Jordan River and is controlled by Israel. So that's the internationally recognized solution to the Israeli-Palestinian crisis. Now, here are some maps of the West Bank. And I'm going to show you Israel in the West Bank. Remember, the West Bank is supposed to be completely free with part of Jerusalem. I'm not even showing you maps of Jerusalem and how that is being Judaized. But this is 1995. Remember the Oslo Accords, 1993, the idea for many, especially progressive Jews, that we were now on the road to peace with some justice. And here is the 1995 map. In dark brown, that goes immediately to Palestinians. The light brown, controlled by Israel and the Palestinians, but will go to the Palestinians. And the lightest brown will remain with Israel. And the triangles, blue, purple, are Jewish settlements. Now notice that all the borders of the West Bank are Israel. And if you take the dark brown and the light brown, you'll see that in between and around is Israel too. Israel permanently in the West Bank. And, of course, controlling it. This is what Jeff Halper, who's been here, has called the matrix of control. What you have is Palestinians in population centers, Israel taking most of the land with the least Palestinians. These are going to get repetitive, but that's the lesson. This is Netanyahu 1. He's returned, right? Do you remember how many progressive Jews told you, or you told yourself, that Sharon could never be elected Prime Minister of Israel because he was too far outside the consensus of Israeli politics, even though he had been in just about every government that Israel had had? He was elected twice. Do you remember Mrs. Rabin inviting Yasser Arafat to her home after her husband was assassinated, but not letting Netanyahu come? Do you remember she said that if people like Netanyahu ran the country, her children or grandchildren would not live in Israel? (2000). Dark brown Palestine, light brown Israel, and around you see the triangles for settlements. See where they are? More or less same map. Barak's generous offer. If you look at the fourth picture, that's the West Bank. The orange, gold, Palestine, white, Israel. Borders and in between. Taba, supposedly the greatest offer to the Palestinians. Sharon on a good day. He was feeling very generous. We just don't understand why the Palestinians don't accept their freedom when offered.
Can you explain that, Marc?
Do I need to explain it now?
No, visually I'm not getting which area or what.
Well, brown is Palestine. White is Israel. Blue triangles, Israeli settlements, so that eventually brown and blue, or brown and purple. They're the same maps, give or take. This is a separation wall, Gush Shalom, this is some years ago, showing where it was going and where it would go. And again, if it's a security wall, it could be inside Israel, but it's not. And why on the other side? Maybe they want to protect Jordan from the Palestinians too. It's very complicated. But it's the same map with a wall around it now. 2006, yellow Palestine, white Israel. 2007, (2008), oh, 1940s. This is what became Israel. The West Bank is in white. These are Palestinian villages that were destroyed when the Palestinians were cleansed from what became Israel. And this is a map of Jewish identity that we don't think about and we don't see. Again, the West Bank. So here are two maps of Jewish identity. And some Israelis, some Israeli architects who wrote the book, A Civilian Occupation, think that what's happening in the West Bank, the movement of Palestinians toward the Jordan River and the settlements there, are really a continuation of the settlement of the interior of Israel once the Palestinians were cleansed. And that it's a movement of settling which is continuing rather than a new phase or something different. Now, I live in the United States in a settler state, and so do you. I love visiting forts. Forts are the cutting edge of settlement, aren't they? And in my country, there are people on reservations, and in your country too. So Israel's not the only settler state, but it is a settler state. Yes, the Holocaust. And by the way, if you're interested, this is something in the Holocaust class. I know I'm not teaching it today, but it's these numbers. You wonder where these numbers come from and why they're there. They come because IBM tabulated the Holocaust. I don't know how many of you have read the book, IBM and the Holocaust. It was the first use of the computer, the Hollerith machine. IBM made its money through computerizing two systems, the Social Security system in the United States and the Nazi system, especially the concentration and death camps. And the number is on the forearm because it used to be on the back or whatever, but so many bodies stacked up on one another, it was hard to see it. So the Holocaust, yes, it happened. It's a trauma. It is a deep part of Jewish history. But these other maps as well. Now we could extend the maps. We could put an American flag there. That's part of Jewish identity too, but also a Canadian flag. Mahatma Gandhi, not Jewish. But he was surrounded by Jews. There's a very interesting book titled Gandhi's Jewish Friends. And Gandhi wrote a letter on every subject in world history, and that's why his writings, he didn't write but a book or so, are 100 volumes. I'm trying to get them from my center. In 1938, he wrote a letter to the German Jews. And he said, you know, it's unbelievably difficult for you, but you are citizens of Germany. You must stand up for your citizenship and for your rights. Nonviolent struggle. Some of you will be in prison, some of you will die, but in the end, Germans will recognize your humanity and you will be accepted. Gandhi was wrong. Gandhi did not understand European violence in Europe. A second part of his letter was about the Jewish settlers in Palestine. He said, you're welcome to live anywhere in the world. But if you try to create a state and expel the Arabs of Palestine, you will be seen as colonialists and imperialists. Martin Buber is a Jew, or was, one of the great Jews of the 20th century. Viennese Jew, lived in Germany, expelled in 1938, went to Jerusalem and argued for a binational state. He was a homeland spiritual Zionist. He believed in a collective living in Palestine alongside an Arab collective because Jews needed to be rerouted in the land to redevelop spoken Hebrew, education, kibbutz, particularity, but giving that to the world universally. He writes to Gandhi and says, you do not understand the violence of the Nazis. Buber was right. And he says to Gandhi about settlements in Palestine among Jews, if we create a state, you're right, we will be correctly seen as colonialists and imperialists, but we have no desire to do that. Martin Buber, one of the most famous Jews of the 20th century, was against the establishment of the State of Israel. But yet he was a Zionist, a cultural or homeland Zionist. Dietrich Bonhoeffer, a Lutheran pastor who gave his life trying to assassinate Adolf Hitler. Bonhoeffer talked about cheap grace and costly grace. Cheap grace was just, I'm blessed by God, it doesn't matter what I do, I'm saved. Costly grace meant suffering, doing justice. Gandhi said to his people, burn your British clothes. When you burn them, you burn their shame. You burn your shame. What do we Jews have to burn? With regard to Bonhoeffer, it's become pretty easy to be Jewish. Cheap Jewishness. The Jewishness that is high mobility, high status, pure innocence. What is costly Jewishness? Edward Said. He's already ill here, but you can see handsome, a prince, and he knew it. Palestinian. It's interesting, most Palestinians see their struggle as universal against a violent Jewish particularity, but it's not. It's a particularity, too, and a very beautiful one at times. Said spent his whole lifetime writing against essentialism, against any fixed identity. He didn't think Palestine was overly important, but Palestinians had a right to be free. But with Oslo, when that was signed by Arafat, you'll notice if you follow Edward Said's career, he went ballistic. He wrote more than ever. He was furious. He couldn't contain his anger. And I want to tell you why, in my view. He thought Palestinians were better than that. He thought Palestinians were exceptional. He was mourning that loss, as many Jews do, with reference to Jewishness. Noam Chomsky. I'm often overshadowed when I tour, and certainly when I was in London a few weeks ago, there's Chomsky, maybe for his last tour of England. And he is decking out the halls, and at all the universities they have these rooms with big screens that are projecting it, and I'm trying to get 50 people to hear me. And he deserved it, no problem. And one of the reasons he gets thousands is because he's seen as a universal figure, but that's a mistake. If you look at Chomsky's background, born and raised in a totally Jewish family, and he is a Zionist. Never talks about it, rarely does. He's a homeland Zionist. And in a new book coming out, there's an interview with him which talks about that. So these universal figures, Edward Said and Noam Chomsky, are very particular. And the beautiful Hannah Arendt with the cigarette and everything. Hannah Arendt went to the Eichmann trial, most of you would know this story, and wrote a series of articles which later became a book talking about Eichmann and the banality of evil. Well, if you want to ever see a Jewish figure vilified, read the literature that responded to Hannah Arendt's book. I can identify with it very much. But then look back. Most of her writings, and there's a new edition of her Jewish writings, most of her writing is about Jews. And she was expelled from Germany. She had to flee the Nazis, helped Jewish refugees when she came to America, and worked with Judah Magnus, who was another homeland spiritual Zionist and the first president of Hebrew University. Not a marginal Jew at all. He was also against the formation of a Jewish state. And he spent his last years in Washington lobbying Secretary of State Marshall and President Harry Truman not to recognize a state of Israel. In fact, he asked President Truman to land American troops in Jerusalem to keep Palestine together. Now, those of you who are against American interventionism, I'm with you, but that would be a good one. Well, Hannah Arendt wrote, if you want to see prophetic writing about what would happen if Israel was created, look at her writing in 1947 and 1948. It's in the Jewish writings. It's available now. She says, among other things, she has 3 points. One, if Israel becomes a state, they will have to expel Palestinians, and there will be an eternal war in the Middle East. Second, if Israel becomes a state and expels Palestinians, the state will have to be militarized to fight that endless war. And therefore, the values that would come from the homeland sense of Zionism would be consumed in warfare. And then third, if Israel became a state, expelled the Palestinians, became militarized, the Jewish diaspora would become militarized. And in the end, no dissent would be tolerated. Oh, unknown. Oren Ben-Dor. Met him in Boston at a one-state conference, the first one-state conference in the United States. He's a philosopher of law at the University of Southampton in the UK, just visited him there. One of the most sensitive men I've ever met. He, with 750 to 1 million other Israelis, have left Israel permanently. He left many years ago. And although each Israeli that leaves has their own personal story, as a collective we have to ask why such a huge percentage of the population lives outside permanently. After all, if the idea is we were exiled and now we've returned to the land, there's a new exile, the Israeli diaspora. And although some of those Israelis who had left used to yell at me, this is years ago, now they come up to me and ask me for help because they want a way out. Why are these Israelis in exile? They couldn't do it anymore. That's what I think. A lot of them had done it, what they were told to do by the state, but they couldn't do it. Well, for those of you who don't think I know why there's a state, my teacher was Richard Rubinstein, who's a hawk on Israel. And in 1966, he wrote the book after Auschwitz. There's my edition, $2.45. And Rubinstein asked the question, where was God at Auschwitz? Our protector, the God who had said, "You are my people. I will be with you." Where was God at Auschwitz? Rubinstein said, God wasn't. The covenant, which has two sides, the people have to do, but God has to do. God didn't. We're done. He says it a little more intellectually, but that's what I got when I was 18 and sitting there. By the way, when Rubinstein announced this, he didn't then give you a hug, like we're supposed to do in America as teachers. He was not a huggy. He just announced it, left the room, and I sat there at my desk, you know. Look at Isaiah. Look at Amos. Look at Ezekiel. It's scorched earth. Well, his first book was 1966, and here's his book, The Cunning of History, which I still use in my Holocaust class, 98 pages, power. When you're done with that, you might want to check out of the human race. Rubinstein basically says that the 20th century is a century of mass death. The Holocaust is a paradigm for the future. And that history is a cycle of violence and atrocity. You either have power or you don't. We didn't have power. We have to have power. Israel is our power. Don't talk to me about morality. By the way, love Rubinstein for this. He says the Palestinians have every right to fight us. Many Jews today just can't imagine that Palestinians are fighting us. How dare they? And I always think, what are they supposed to send, love balloons? But the idea that a Jew could be fought, or a Jew could be hated for what they do, like stealing land, settling it, is so foreign to the Jewish imagination now. But Rubenstein says, sure, I'd fight them too, but hey, tough. They come after us, we beat them down. Otherwise, we're dead. If we don't understand this in Jewish discussion, we don't understand Constantinian Judaism. Now, Constantinian Jews aren't bad people. That's too easy. They have a view of the world, and they want to enforce a view of the world that comes from this analysis. You can reject the analysis, but you have to understand it, I think, in order to understand the Jewish conversation. Elie Wiesel, most of you would know of him. I use his book, Night, in my Holocaust class, but it's interesting that my students, this is his autobiographical journey through Auschwitz, where he lost his family. But my students come to my class, and they've already read Night 3 times. In junior high and in high school, mandated classes in the Holocaust. I'm not against it, but how does that function? Now, I know Oprah announced her retirement, and I want to be straight up. I'm jealous. I want to be on Oprah before she retires. It means at least 1 million books sold. I don't think I'm going to get there. But I just want to tell you honestly, I'd like to be there, so I don't want to, hide behind this. But notice when this translation came out, it was Oprah's book club selection, which made it a bestseller again. It sold millions of copies in its new edition. And by the way, Oprah went with Wiesel to Auschwitz, and the DVD is available. It's interesting, you have an African-American, slavery, never mentions it in this visit. Of course, both of extreme wealth, although Wiesel lost his money with the Madoff scandal. Don't worry. Don't worry. Don't worry about him. His speaking engagements are $50,000 to $100,000 a shot. I'd also like to get that. But the question, I had nice hotels on this tour. I mean, pretty nice, but they were done through Hotwire. Now, if you don't know about Hotwire, they give you the worst rooms that are available, but sometimes better ones are available. When you think of this death, what the Holocaust represents, the Oprah's book club, and so much else, what Norman Finkelstein calls the Holocaust industry, right? Okay? It trivializes the Holocaust. And when we use the Holocaust to justify the ghettoization of a people, it trivializes the Holocaust. So how, as the Holocaust is talked about more and more, and I teach it, and the students need to learn about it, but I also have to tell the students my position on Israel and Palestine. It's not emphasized, it's not the whole course or even a big part of it, but I can't tell the students about the Holocaust and pretend that we are innocent. Because the teaching of the Holocaust and Holocaust studies and Jewish studies in universities, which often fences off dissent, often censors dissent, trivializes the Holocaust. Going local, Emil Fackenheim, German Jew, came to Canada, taught at the University of Toronto for many years, went to Israel after he retired and died there. Greenberg also said, I don't know about God, but in the '67 war, when he felt that Jews were threatened with another Holocaust, he believed that Jews responded not by hearing the commanding voice of Sinai, which we can't, but hearing the commanding voice of Auschwitz. What he calls the 614th commandment. Now again, this is all through Jewish speech. and conversation. Orthodox Jews have 613 commandments, but Fackenheim believed that the Jewish people responded with their own commandment to survive and not to let Hitler win. Survival at all costs. Otherwise, Hitler wins. Now, I also, well, since Fackenheim issued a commandment, I have two. I'll see if I can get to it. The Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C. By the way, I gave a lecture there. Emil Fackenheim found out about it and faxed the 25 most influential Jewish persons in the United States, or the ones he thought, protesting my talk at the Holocaust Museum some years ago. And the Holocaust Museum is a haunting museum. When you walk through the doors, it's haunting. So, memory, testimony, witness, but also it's a symbol of our power. Because after all, on the Washington Mall in the capital city, it's the only museum to an event that didn't happen in America. It happened in Europe. We have the Americanization or the Canadianization of the Holocaust. Interesting that the way it's constructed, the museum, when you come out, you see the Washington Monument. Lesson, can't happen in America. Well, it didn't, but it can. On the Palestinians, of course, it's silent. And you would think, well, of course, it's about the Holocaust. It's not about Palestine. But the museum does have an ending. And what if we had some Palestinian faces there at the end? Pictures. Would that change the meaning of the Holocaust or the challenges of the Holocaust now? Holocaust theology is deep, really deep. I don't want to caricature it. Rabbi Irving Greenberg wrote, this is in 1974, after the Holocaust, no statement, theological or otherwise, should be made that would not be credible in the presence of the burning children. If you want to speak about God, if it makes sense to a burning child, otherwise be silent. Can't have a more radical statement about God than that. But it's interesting, he says theological or otherwise. Theological or political, theological or economic, theological or military. In 1988, I visited Palestinians in the hospitals around Jerusalem who had been shot by Israeli soldiers. They were brain dead or paralyzed for life. And I wrote a poem. And it started with a statement. And I raised the question whether Palestinian children were burning. And if Palestinian children weren't also our own. Now, I know in Canada you're too sophisticated to be believers, so this is for my audience back home. You don't have to worry about it. I live among moderate and evangelical Christians, and again, it's quite interesting, and they've given me a home. The liberals haven't, by the way. But Greenberg says about faith, after Auschwitz, we now have to speak of moment faiths, moments when Redeemer and vision of redemption are present, interspersed with times when the flames of smoking children blot out our faith, though it flickers again. This is not right to say, I'm a theist, you're an atheist, or you're an atheist, I'm a theist. It's within us. Now, when I say this to some Jews on the left, they don't like that theist part. I know. It's tough. 1974, he concludes with 2 warnings. The victims ask us above anything else not to allow the creation of another matrix of values that might sustain another attempted genocide. He doesn't say just against Jews. He says against genocide. There are 2 parts of Holocaust theology. Never again to the Jews. Yeah, right, I agree. Never again to anyone. That's dropped out. That's been secondary. That's almost gone. Another warning. The Holocaust cannot be used for triumphalism. Its moral challenge must also be applied to Jews. That's about Israel, 1974. In Holocaust theology, there's depth, especially about God. About Palestinians, either silence or they're terrorists. Greenberg makes the last stab at incorporating Palestinians into his analysis. This is in 1988, The Ethics of Jewish Power, when Israel is seen by Jews and others as crushing the Palestinian uprising. He writes The Ethics of Jewish Power, and he says, look, we've been the great prophets, but we can't afford it anymore. When we didn't have power, we critiqued power. When we have power, we can't use the prophetic critique, lest it undermine our empowerment and another Holocaust happen. The prophetic has to take a back seat. We're going through the difficult phase of normalization, he says, where we're going to do many things that look a lot like what was done to us. Don't panic, he says. To retain our power, we have to do it. We can try to correct some of the bad things. Of course, Greenberg doesn't give up on Jewish exceptionality. So he says we have to be different than others, but how much different can we be and survive? So he has a scale. We can't be 100% better and survive. No way. 90, 80, 70, 60, 50, 40, no. 30, 20, we can be 10% better. And he names that, 10%. Israel is different. We're coming to the end. We could go on for a longer time, but I'm going to. In the interfaith ecumenical dialogue after the war, many Christians said, our theology is covered with blood. I don't want it. They reformed the liturgy. They changed parts of the Christian narrative. They tried to rediscover their roots before the church. Revolutionary. Digging into the past and trying to move into the future. And Jews said to Christians, get off our backs, which we had every right to. And we will define ourselves. You've been defining us. We're going to define ourselves. We will critique your history. You must accept Israel as repentance for your anti-Semitism. That was the ecumenical dialogue. It became what I call the interfaith ecumenical deal, where we critique Christian history and demand silence on ours. Now, again, those of you who are too sophisticated for faith, it's also a political deal, which now is more relevant in Canada. The political deal is simple. Israel is different. You can be against South Africa and its white regime as a politician, but you can't speak up for Palestinians, or your political future is done. If you notice in the American political campaign, forgetting about the conservatives, look at the speeches that Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton gave to AIPAC. They outdo themselves to be more pro-Israel than the other. And if you look at Obama's Cairo address to the Muslim world, interesting, he talked about the need for a Jewish homeland, he said, not a state. Interesting. Don't know whether that had meaning or not. And then went to Buchenwald after the Cairo meeting and met there with Elie Wiesel. Do you remember that? because Jews have a history, and no one should be against the Jewish state because of that history. But he didn't go to a Palestinian refugee camp also. And when he talked about Palestinians, he said, and Palestinians are also searching for a homeland. But didn't they have one? Palestinians have no history in that speech. So Israel is different in the interfaith ecumenical deal, but also in the political dialogue in America and Canada. Progressive Jews in Tikkun, remember what I said? The left wing of Constantinian Judaism. Jews of conscience. These are all children of Holocaust survivors. Dr. Sarah Roy, the Harvard Center for Middle Eastern Study, a child of Holocaust survivors, a world expert on Gaza. Amira Haas, many of you have read her articles. She is one of the few Israeli journalists who live among Palestinians. She's a child of Holocaust survivors. Hetty Epstein, who was on the Kinder transport. She got out as a child in the 1930s from Nazi Germany. Her parents were both killed by the Nazis. She demonstrates against the occupation. She's been on the ships to Gaza. Here's a woman who is part of a group that pickets a synagogue in Michigan. Very controversial. Every Friday or Saturday morning. Some Israeli soldiers who refused to serve in the West Bank. Ilan Pappé, who has left Israel too, is an Israeli historian, now in Exeter in England. The ethnic cleansing of Palestine, by the way. The narrative of the formation of the State of Israel and its history will be told the way Ilan Pappé tells it. The narrative has been won. Politically, we've lost everything. Trees of reconciliation. When I was a kid, we were asked to contribute money as kids, nickels and dimes, to create forests in Israel to replicate the European environment that many of the Israelis came from. But as we find out now, they were mostly planted on destroyed Arab villages. So Hannah Schwarzschild, among others, has started Trees of Reconciliation, planting olive trees. She said she never planted a tree before, but she looks terrific there, doesn't she? It's a little tree, but it could grow if it's not bulldozed. And here's an attempt to shape a new narrative. This is what some Jews in Philadelphia have created, a Jews of Conscience poster. There's Dr. Sarah Roy, Albert Einstein, Chomsky, oh, there's me. Judah Magnus, Hannah Arendt, Ilan, Izzy Stone. Jews of conscience are trying to shape a new narrative about what it means to be Jewish. Here I'll end with the new 10 Commandments. And even of you who are not religious may be able to embrace them. You will not kill. You will not starve others. You will not torture. You will not assassinate. You will not covet Palestinian land. You will not demolish homes. You will not uproot trees. You will not block ambulances. You will not besiege. End the occupation. Thank you very much.